Hi, folks. I'm Dan Dworkis, and this is the Emergency Mind Podcast, a space where we bring together lessons from the emergency department and beyond about performance when it matters the most and applying knowledge under pressure. All right, our guest this episode is Dr. Glenn Fox. Now, Glenn, in addition to being someone who I am lucky enough to call a friend, is a faculty member at USC's Lloyd Greif Center for Entrepreneurial Studies, where he's the director and founder of the USC Found Well initiative. Now, this aims to understand and promote the entrepreneurial mindset in founders and business leaders. Glenn received his Ph.D. in neuroscience from USC, where he focused on neurocorrelates of gratitude, empathy, and neuroplasticity, all of which I think we're about to dig into during this conversation. Outside of USC, Glenn is the Chief Science Officer of the C4 Foundation, which serves to strengthen and protect Navy SEAL families, and he sits on the advisory board of the Flow Research Collective, which, in my humble opinion, is just plain epic. Now, before we get started, a quick reminder, if you want to be more involved with the Emergency Mind Project community, we would absolutely love to have you, and there are so many ways to link up. The easiest thing to do is to head to emergencymind.com, look in the upper right corner of the screen up there, and take the Crisis Skills Test. It's free, it's quick, and it's a great way to test your skills and habits against those of elite performers across different domains. All right. All of that said, let's jump into what I think is going to be just a damn cool discussion. So, Glenn, it's great to see you, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Of course, my pleasure, Dan. Always good. This is basically like one of our standard phone calls, but we're gonna share it for posterity. So yeah,
Exactly.
thanks for bringing me on.
Exactly. So we've had some of the backstory behind this is that we both work at USC, although in very different worlds, and linked up at some point or another and have done a series of sort of, well, I would say very interesting, although I'm a little biased, conversations about the mix of performance in the worlds of emergency medicine and the worlds of entrepreneurship. There are way more corollaries and similarities here than you might think on the surface. And I think that's something we're going to get into. But over the course of doing that, we found, hey, we're both folks that approach the world of performance with an eye of trying to learn from the best of what other people have sort of figured out and map that onto what's going on in day-to-day life. So maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a great place to start. Why don't we get into that? How did somebody who has a background in deep neuroscience get into entrepreneurship? What is that link like?
It's a much more natural connection than I think people realize. It's quite simple, is that I'm really interested in stress. I'm really interested in how humans feel as a process, right? Like, how do we feel things? How do we have emotion? How do we process the things that happen to us? And how do those feelings influence our outcomes? As a neuroscientist, I was kind of an odd duck because I was always interested in unique subject populations. I was always fascinated with how can I find the people doing something really rare, really unique, and how could I learn from their brains and translate that into everyday lives and workplaces. My first research study was actually a study of frontal lobotomy, looking at plasticity and actually measuring frontal lobotomy using modern imaging tools known as diffusion tensor imaging. And it really set me up for a love of lesion studies, patient studies, of studies of people who are kind of different in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And most neuroscientists aren't after this. The lesion studies go back, the original neuroscience studies are all lesion studies,
Sure.
right? But now with, kind of the modern tools from psychology and brain imaging, people are really after universal cognitive architecture, meaning what's true for one person, what's true for all the people, right? So, vision science is probably the most developed of, the nervous system, fields of study, right? And that's fantastic. It's a great way to learn things, and but it just doesn't tug at my heartstrings. So
Yeah.
even in graduate school, I was like, I worked at a lab with a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio, who is my advisor, and Antonio and Hannah, his wife, made their career studying lesion patients, and they were neurologists, and that's why I really wanted to work with them, because they were some of the people who were most dedicated to understanding unique individuals. And so they brought me into their lab, and I really loved it there. but it still wasn't really applied enough for me. I really wanted to go out and look at what are the really rare people, what are the people doing who are able to undertake immense stress, people who are doing something so different than the normal people. And I always wanted to work with elite athletes. I always wanted to work with, you know, folks in the military. And I was able to get some of that in my last position with the Performance Science Institute, but it still was, there was kind of like, I kind of went so far that those folks are really hard to get a hold of and really hard to study and really hard to make sense of. So I thought, well, what's the middle? And in the middle of that is entrepreneurship. It's founders. So every founder that wants to start a company is going to undergo a process. Now, I don't think founders are in of themselves particularly interesting, to be honest. In fact, there's no real personality traits that predict whether somebody will be a successful founder. There's not really a predictive model for, okay, you've got 100 people, let's give them a survey, and from that we'll deduce there's five of these people. It just doesn't work like that. But the process of entrepreneurship is really universal, as people are going to take some degree of risk, not always a lot, but some degree of risk. They're going to try to create value in some form or another. They're going to try to build and solicit resource, and they're going to try to onboard stakeholders, right? And then see what happens. So every founder undergoes this process, and there's some really unique hallmarks in it. There's some very interesting theories about how people build and start companies. And so for me, it's been a really natural extension of my interest in unique populations and emotion combined with a vocation that repeats itself over and over again. So for founders who are taking on these risks, who are really trying to start up something interesting, you can find them all over. You can find them in, of course, you know, our tech founders who want scalable, exponential growth, all that high risk, high disruption kind of thing. They're interesting. But also you can see the same sorts of hallmarks in people that are, they just need to put food on the table. So they come up with an idea, they start selling sandwiches, they start doing whatever. And so there's some kind of universalities to it that are really interesting. And you can find these people more readily. So the other interesting thing is that the risk is, the risks for founders are different than they are for you know, a military operator, right? So they're internal risks in a way, right? You have real risks, right? You can, you know, some founders will mortgage their own homes. They can end up in really bad financial state, of course. But the challenges are, how well can the mind handle the mind, as opposed to, you know, people training to become reconnaissance Marines, where it's how well can the mind handle the body, which is really super interesting. And some of those things translate and some of them don't, right? So I think it's really interesting to kind of move over to a set of task demands for founders that are entirely cognitive and affective at the same time. So long story. I hope that clarifies a little bit.
No, that's awesome. I'm gonna go backward and fill in one or two links here, which is that if you don't have a background in neuroscience, what Glenn's talking about when he talks about lesion patients, right, or lesion studies, these are brains which are altered in one way or another from sort of what you'd call like the average brain architecture, either because of trauma or because of disease or surgery in some cases, where one part of the brain is actually basically just disconnected or destroyed, and that results in the brain behaving in a different way than normal. By a lot of classical neuroscience was done through experimentation by simply turning off in one form or another different parts of the brain and being like, oh, that's what that thing does, right? In a very sort of like roughshod manner. My apologies to my other neuroscience friends who are listening to my attempt to explain neuroscience.
I'm just going to quote Dan as saying, this is exactly how the brain works. And, yeah,
I don't pretend to know exactly how the brain works. However, I do find this question of how can the mind handle the mind and its relationship to the physical brain that's, you know, related to, so absolutely fascinating. I also want to go back to one thing you said, which is like, do we study elite extreme examples of something, or do we study a universal cognitive architecture? Because these are two very different approaches to getting at the things, right? And this is a tension and a dichotomy that we see a lot over the course of the Emergency Mind Project, which is what is it that we're trying to do when our goal is to improve the application of knowledge under pressure, right? Should we be studying the far out edge of what the minimal few can accomplish? Or should we be studying what everybody can accomplish most of the time and pushing that forward a little bit, which is the right direction? It's sort of a false dichotomy. There's probably not a right direction, right? They both give you different things in different pieces, but it's worth calling that out in a way. I guess I'd ask, like, when it comes to the ability of the mind to handle stress and the ability of a human to handle stress and pressure, and really, we're not talking about the physical body handling stress and pressure as much as we are, let's say, the ability to maintain high quality decision making over time under pressure, right? Whatever the mental task is, right? Mm-hmm. So the ability to make complex logical decisions well, or to make complex decisions under uncertain conditions well. What do we know about the universal cognitive architecture of that? How does that work for most people? Yeah, it's a small question.
I'd start by saying that, just a small question. Yeah. No, I'd start by saying that we feel first and think second. That a lot of times we really hope that maybe this time, if we just have the right thoughts and the right rationale, our performance will follow. But emotion and decision making have to work together, right? And when we talk about emotion, when most people hear the word, they probably think of something bad. They probably think of somebody crying or panicking or wrought with anger. But emotion is happening constantly. It's unfolding in response to everything that's happening both outside of our bodies that we can perceive. But emotion is a behavior that is taking place inside the body, right? So emotion and feeling is a system for monitoring the internal status of our body. And that's what it's for. You have 20/20 vision, hopefully, or I do because I wear contact lenses, and for the outside world. And then we have some other systems for what we call interoception, right? So eyes are for exteroception, right? Interoception means looking inward, right? And monitoring what's happening in the body. And what's interesting, whether you're an emergency room physician or a toddler or an entrepreneur or a professor or whatever, this system of emotion and feeling is unfolding at all times and will influence our perceptions, will influence our decision making, and will influence everything about how we see the world in even a predictive manner in many cases. And that's universal. In fact, Antonio, my advisor, was one of the first people to devise a test known as the Iowa gambling task to begin to dissociate emotion and decision making, and using lesion patients. So these were patients with damage to part of their brain known as the medial prefrontal cortex. So right up above your nose and between your eyes, like right up over there. That people with lesions to this part of the brain could not make good decisions. Their lives were falling apart. They usually had to end up with some sort of stewardship, some sort of person to help them see their way through the world. And what's interesting is when you look at their decision-making process, like if you say, okay, do you want to eat lunch here or there? They would concoct a pro and con list for each one. They would have these really, quote, rational structures for making decision-making because they didn't have the ability to link their emotions with their decision-making. So you need both, right? I'm a scientist. I'm a big fan of reason, big fan of the Enlightenment and, all those different things. But it still comes back to feeling. It still comes back to how we feel. And those feelings influence our ability to make a decision. I hope you didn't, sometimes you could make a pro and con list about where do you want to eat for lunch, but it's not very efficient and it's mostly unnecessary. And in the meantime, these people have no ability to forecast decision-making over time. They are, in some ways, this is kind of a paradox, right? Is that if you don't have the ability to feel how an emotion could play out over time, then you're left with immediate decisions, and thus the desire for immediate gratification goes up considerably, right? Because you're no longer, you're thinking very rationally, do you want $1,000 now or no dollars? And you're like, I'll take $1,000, right? So it's actually kind of a paradox when you dive into these things, right? So the studies of high performers, the studies of people who learn to, meditate and really kind of go inside to understand their mind, they're almost always finding interesting differences in these parts of the brain that have to do with emotion, have to do with interoception, a part of the brain called the insula. Um, and these factors are near universal. At some point, you have to learn to understand emotion if you want to perform, right? That knowing how emotion broadly, actually correctly defined, not necessarily broadly defined, but correctly defined, means that at all times you're thinking with your gut. You're thinking, okay, how does that work? How can I push aside emotions that are not useful now? How can I cultivate emotions that might help? How do I cultivate thoughts that predispose me to those emotions, and vice versa, right? So this aspect of interoception and awareness is absolutely critical for performance.
So let's push on that. So what actually is emotion? I mean, I know you said it's an internal scan system that sort of, interocepts what's going on, but I think for a lot of folks, sometimes myself included, like it's still like a little gremlin jumping around being like, do this. Right. So like what is emotion? What do we think that it is? How do we think that it works?
Yeah. It's important to distinguish emotion and feeling,
Okay.
actually, right? So when we talk about emotion, at least in the laboratory and in my background and my training, emotion is a physical change in the body. It's a behavior. It's something that is measurable, not easy to measure, but is or could be measured through the release of, chemicals into the bloodstream, right? It's the flushing of our cheeks. It's the dilation of our pupils, the sweating of our palms, etc. These are all the physical manifestation of emotion that we could essentially just call emotion. It's a behavior. It's a measurable behavior that is a change in our body state related to some change in our environment. And that environment can be, of course, the proverbial, bear jumping out of the woods, but it could also be the email that reminds us of that feels like a bear, in which case triggers many of the same systems of emotion. And then those emotions are felt. Okay. And so what we have is emotion being a physical change in the body that's constructed, and it's based on estimates and guesswork, and it's always thinking about the future. Emotion is always have some prediction about the future. That's really what it's trying to do, and it's trying to kind of guess what's happening, right? So I'm kind of at the there's some theorists. I can provide you some links for more reading for people, but then we also need a classification for how emotions are perceived, right? So if I'm saying, okay, emotion has some physical substrate, some behavior, then, okay, what does it mean to feel emotion? Well, the feeling is the hidden conscious perception of emotion. So feeling is a verb related to feeling emotion. So it's the sense of, oh, what it feels like to be grateful, right? And that's the part that's hidden and personal for each of us, right? So I don't really know what fear might feel like to somebody else. I know what it feels like for myself. We may be able to measure some of the substrates of fear, but using those substrates to predict a specific type of feeling, or even to say, oh, this brain region is active, therefore this person is feeling fear, is a really tough one, right? So feeling is the part that like we keep hidden, that is very hard to interrogate, and very hard for us to sort of say we understand what a feeling is to another person. It's all going to come down to probabilities. But this is what we mean to say emotion is sort of the process of our body changing in response to stimulus. And then the feeling is the awareness of certain emotions. We don't necessarily, this is where it gets weird and it gets a little fuzzy. And I know we all love buckets, like that's a feeling, that's an emotion, but then we go into moods. Well, okay, where's a mood? Like, what is this? What are some
Sure.
of these terms we have? It gets harder to define, but by giving us some fuzzy boundaries between these concepts, it gets more clear to say, okay, this is what we mean by emotion, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me see if I understand this, to boil this very slightly, which is that there's some change that I or my body perceives. And that could be a small change in the pattern of, the wave I'm looking at when I'm surfing, or the way my opponent's weight shifts in jujitsu, or something bigger than that, or who knows. And there's some um, unconscious or hidden from conscious computations going on about what that signal means in terms of my likelihood of success or failure at some goal.
Mm-hmm.
And then as a result of that computation, the bubbling up of that knowledge towards the consciousness of my body is a series of physiological changes, which we're going to package into what we'd call an emotion. Right. So these are the things you listed,
Yep.
like the physiological changes, chemical, cascades, all of this stuff. Then and again, sincere apologies to my neuroscience friends. Then some other version of me is looking at that list of things that's happening and comparing it to some other list and goes, oh, that's fear, or oh, that's excitement, or oh, that's, I'm not really sure. Maybe that's like a little bit of both, right? You're looking at like a sort of a
Mm-hmm.
recipe of what you're cooking in there. Is that like
That's not
really
bad. Yeah,
rough?
totally.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say what gets weird is the feeling part, right? Because then we're talking
Mm,
about consciousness,
sure.
and it's just mysteries all the way down, right?
Yeah.
And so what you have is kind of what I've sort of landed on is you've had some version of a self, right? A concept of who Dan is, um, and what it means to be Dan, your autobiographical history, and your everything that is your essence. And that essence is what feels the emotion. And that's where you're going to be slipping into talking about
Sure.
consciousness very quickly. So
Sure. All right. We
so
got to
we
take a
don't
half step
necessarily
back
need to
here.
go
Yeah.
we don't necessarily need to go into that. Some great reading. So again, knowing my biases. So I'm a student
Sure.
of Antonio Damasio, who has been at the forefront of these things. There's some modern theories coming up too that I think are really, really interesting. My research is focused on something called the biopsychosocial model, which looks at behavior of the heart under stress.
Hmm.
And so we can dive in. I hope we do, but I want to zoom up on one of your summaries. So you did the nice summary there. What I want to kind of highlight in a practical sense is like what it's like to learn something, right? Like
Hmm.
if I'm in the emergency room with you, um, obviously somebody's going to, like, if I'm there sitting in your shoes, first of all, bad things are about to happen. Like it's not going to work. I have no idea. But even if you said, hey, look, here's the 10 things you got to look out for, right? Um, I could go through that list of things, but you are going to see them and feel them immediately,
Sure.
right? Like you're going to be clued into, oh, you're before you even know it, like, oh, check this. This is what's happening here. And that system of learning, this goes really well into intuition.
Hmm.
Um, and was it Gary Klein with Sources of
Yeah.
Power?
Hmm.
I think you're the
Yep.
one who recommended that book to me.
Oh
And
yeah. The
he talks
recognition prime decision making. Yeah, exactly.
exactly. And so that's perfect handshake with this theory.
Mm.
So if you are into that theory, this is a really good handshake for that because it's kind of removing sort of a cosmic essence and just saying, no, we actually learn through feeling, we learn through emotion, and our emotions and our instincts often precede our ability to reason through that. So one of the things about these tasks where they measure decision making and risk, um, namely the Iowa gambling test that I referred to earlier, is that as people are learning to get good at this process, learning to get good at the game that they're playing, people's strategies for winning the game improve before they have a conscious feeling of the emotion of what leads to optimal outcomes. Okay, so in other words, let me put that in even more plain English, is that people know what to do before they know what to do. They know what the right
Mm-hmm.
decision is before you say, why'd you choose that card? Why'd you choose this? Why'd you choose that? And as people are like, I don't know, I just kind of feel it. And then subsequent to that, or after that, they will go, oh, I figured out these two decks are work. So you're actually, these two decisions tend to play out better. And you're actually, your decision making strategies improve before your actual awareness and quote reason for choosing those things does. So I use this a lot in my workshop, right? So I'm a hobbyist. I make things. I have if it were colder out and not 100 degrees, I'd be in the shop right now showing you these things. And there's something about building something where, like, welding is a good example. Like, it's not super hard to learn to MIG weld. It's not, it's the low, well, it's not, it's probably the lowest form of welding. I won't get into it, but it's like one thing you learn is before you could even say, like, oh, that's a good weld, you get a feeling for, like, oh, that was good. Like the way it sizzles, the way you see how the puddle, which is like the molten part of the metal, is flowing. Um, you really get a sense for, like, oh, that's what felt right. And every weld is a little different. You're at a different angle. You've got different thickness of your material. You have different cleanliness of material. I work with a lot of old rusty steel and like fabricate a lot of things out of like, crap I find on the side of the road. And so every weld, um, of course, I have my little chart to tell me, oh, it's this thick and I should put it at this amperage and this wire speed. Um, but then I'll go to weld and there's some feeling that's like, no, it needs a little more amp. I could have a little more amperage here, and I'm going to change and fine tune it based on how I'm feeling about the welds themselves. And when I'm really in touch with that is when my work turns out the best.
Yeah.
Um,
I
surfing is
think
a good
it's,
example too, right? Like,
yeah.
even when you're like, you see the swell coming in, and there's once when you're good, and you're like, oh, it's coming at this angle. I know, okay, here's how it is. But as you're kind of learning, you kind of get a sense of like, oh, I can paddle for this one, or oh no, I'm too far outside, or oh, I'm about to get buried. And what you're learning is that instinct for how fast to paddle, where to situate yourself. And after you've developed, it's actually easier to say, oh, I'm going to angle this way because it's going to break this way. And that process of learning is really about feeling what it's like to have the wave throw and push you forward. Right. So
Mm.
this is the thing about emotion and decision making I find most interesting is this process.
Yeah. Hmm. There's so much in there. I mean, uh, first off, this is like the 10th time I've probably said this in the podcast, but if you are in any one of these worlds, you need to read the Klein and Kahneman paper of Failure to Disagree, right? Where they dig a lot into this idea about like what we're saying, because what's really interesting to me is like, okay, so let's take for granted just for a second the idea that there are incredible architectures of computation going on under the hood here a little bit, and they're going to nudge you towards pattern recognition, and they're going to nudge you towards knowledge in the form of emotional decision making, in large quotes around that, that like are going to guide you before you might have a conscious ability to name the factors that explain that, right? But what's interesting in there is that we used the word improve, right? We said that your skill at the Iowa gambling task improves. So I think what we really mean by that is that you drift in a direction based on what you're understanding about the underlying reality of the game that you're playing. So that's an improvement if your next task requirement is in the same world as the task that you just learned in. It's actually
Mm-hmm.
to your detriment in some sense if the world has changed a little bit around you and you don't realize it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the big underlying questions about this when we get back into the realm of crisis and emergency is, what kind of a world am I in? Am I in a part of the world that is predictable and related to prior experiences, or am I in a world that's really not? How much can I rely on that? And how much should I, sort of choke back a little bit on the pattern recognition that I have versus let it fly? And I think that's a continual space in there. I also think it's worth saying that a problem we hit here a lot is, how do you teach people to do some of these things? right? Because there's a missing step other than like, there's a way of teaching, which is just slam your head against the wall a million times until like you bounce off and you're like, oh, okay, you're right. I get it. I should do this. But presumably if you weld like that, you will catch things and maybe yourself on fire, right? You have to learn how to weld by studying the structure. I mean, I don't know how to weld clearly, right? Like we're just throwing out examples that I don't know, but certainly in jiu-jitsu, if you just throw yourself into a wall over and over again, you get hurt, right? Maybe somebody else gets hurt too.
Why are you wrestling a wall? I'm not sure, but yes.
Exactly, right? You'd be surprised. But the idea is that like you have this sense of, okay, well, here's the underlying reality that I understand and can feel, even if I can't explain. But now I have to transfer this knowledge to somebody, right? So I have to make it explicit in order to say what you described. Like, well, you got to understand the amperage, you got to understand the thickness of the material, all this stuff. So there's these two levels that we're playing this game at. One is what's the world? How do we learn it? And the other is what's the world? How do we teach it?
Yeah. Well, because I mean, it fits well with your book, right? Going back to first principles, like working on mental models that are flexible and adaptable, right?
Sure.
So for founders, one of the hallmarks or predictors of founder failure is the ability to stick with a goal and not keep exploring things, right? So founders are by definition explorers. They're trying to find, oh, this is a source of value that is untapped, and really love being in that creation, idea generation, R&D mode. And this is often a red flag for a lot of investors who are like, no, you've got your thing, you've got to execute it now. We got to find out what's going to happen. You really spend all your time on target on this thing, right? So this whole domain of study, transfer of learning, is a massive area. I think it's partly why, like, those stories not finished on this at all, but the like virtual reality as a training device, right? Like there were a few years ago all these stories about NFL quarterbacks using VR to learn to read the defense and all these things, and you got to think like, well, if that had really scaled according to the promises of it, it'd be everywhere by now, right? Maybe it would. I mean, maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. But it's really hard to get something to translate from one thing to the other. I mean, look at we were fortunate. We hosted Alex Honnold, the rock climber, for an interview a few years ago, and it's not my best interview I've ever done, but I really loved getting to know Alex. He's just a fantastic guy. But they say, oh, Alex Honnold doesn't feel any fear, but you certainly feels a lot less fear than anybody would while free soloing. But he clearly has fear for personal relationships. He clearly has the same fear for vulnerability and emotion. So you're never free of one emotion. You're like, I've conquered my fear in this area. For instance, I'm a professor. Public speaking doesn't really, it gets me excited. I love it. I'm never numb to it. I'm nervous before every single class period. If it's 50 people or 30 or 150 or 300, I'm always nervous before public speaking, but that's part of what gets me excited about it. That's how I know I'm going to give a good lecture. It's like, yeah, I'm like, all right, I'm feeling it. Let's do this. Right. And that would scale perfectly well to, I would be fine speaking in front of any number of people, I mean, depending on the topic, of course, but, it would just get me excited. The more the merrier at this point, right? But if it came down to negotiating with my boss, or doing some of my consulting work, and trying to drop contracts, and like I still have those fears of insecurity of, do I have some imposter syndrome here? What is a neuroscientist doing as a business school professor? Like, what am I doing? What do I offer? And so those aspects of self-doubt are always available to us.
That's such a kind way to put that.
Yeah, right. Why not? You should have these. Self-compassion is I think our greatest superpower. But so this is the thing, is like, this is what makes it so amazing, right? Is like, you're never free from emotion, because it's baked into us. You wouldn't want to be. And then there's weird things, like this is what makes this stuff so fun, so awful to study, is like, but then again, there are times when we have the right analogy that things do kind of unlock, right? Like for me in my studio, um, this summer I spent like installing a really complicated stereo system in my old truck, and it involved fabrication of wood, metal, fiberglass, cloth, like doing all kinds of new techniques that I'd never really done before. And I had a friend who's like my woodworking mentor, and he's way more skilled than I am when it comes to like making a doing a glue up, making like
Mhm.
perfect squares, which is all it is. Um, and this was not a perfect square opportunity. These were all multi angles. There's no math that we're going to use to solve this. It was, all right, let's glue some stuff in this place and do it. And I was really comfortable with that because I had this wide range of experiences
Mhm.
to do it. So, like, I've repaired surfboards with fiberglass. So I'm like, oh, okay, I've used this before. I've done the woodworking with him, of course. And then I've done enough, kind of basic electrical stuff that it didn't bother me to have to do all this complicated wiring. Um, and so there are times, this is what's so maddening, is there are times when that transfer is so perfect, you're just like,
Sure.
boom, got it.
Sure.
And there's other times, so like it's really hard to, it's just so funny, it's hard to predict. And then there's other times you can still just like lock up, right? There's still times when your
Yeah.
brain just goes like, I'm out. Like, oh, turns out you're hungry and you're sleepy and you're under recovered. And that also has a strong bearing on how you're going to perform, So these are slippery, these are really slippery topics. But that's
Yeah.
the fun part to me is like the more you can use the wide range of experiences we have, the better,
Mm.
right? So coming from, neuroscience, even when I was a kid, I don't know if you knew that about me, but I was a child actor. I was in Back to the Future 3 when I was a kid.
I did
Uh,
not know that. Yeah.
yeah. So like I used that experience of being on
Right
set
on.
was when I was 7, being on the set. And I talk about this with my students last week about how that really taught me what flow state looks like. That really
Huh.
taught me what it's like to feel like the thing I'm doing, the thing I want to do, and the thing I am doing are exactly the same. And it really just was this fantastic lesson. I was just really, really, really lucky to get that part because it taught me that lesson
Hmm.
forever that like, if you know exactly where you want to be and you actually get to do that, like how good that feels and how that's something
Mm.
worth really chasing. So I've
Yeah.
always been in pursuit for that, and becoming a professor was the much harder it turned out than getting a line in a movie. Um, but at the same time, I feel that too when I'm teaching and I have a great lesson. I'm like, that's exactly where I want to be.
Yeah.
Um, and so
I mean, Glenn,
that's the upside of this, right? Is like
yeah.
learning to use your heart, literally use your heart to guide goal pursuit, to guide how we
Mm.
make decisions, to say, well, that really makes my heart sing, right? As corny as that can sound, like that's honestly, if I had a superpower, it's like um it's really listening to that, even listening to negative emotions like envy, when I'm like, dang, dude, how did you do that? Like, I really wish I were there. And going, oh, that's something. Like, I just hit something. Like, what do I do to get that? Am I willing to make the changes? Can I sacrifice the things that are comfortable now to get to that? Right. And so I think that's really the
Mm.
basic question that I've been answering in my career. And I've been lucky, it's certainly not a done deal at all. And kind of at a crossroads trying to figure out, what role I want research and practice to play. I know you and I are really similar
Sure.
in that, right? Of like, well, I have the skills. What am I doing to use and honor the degree I worked so hard to get? And sometimes feeling like I'm way behind. Um, and I think be a part of that's just being a adult and balancing real world. I have a son and trying to keep everything happy
Sure.
at home. It's a different math if it wasn't for that. But that's really, to me, is the heart of emotion, is like really learning to listen to your heart, like
Hmm.
literally learning to listen to the signals that tell us when we're going towards something that feels really lined up with who we want to be and where we want to be and what we want to be doing.
Man, I love it. Glenn, thank you so much for that. I have like so many other thoughts on this. I think though the biggest thing that I'm hoping we can do for the last few minutes of this is just, can you Can you talk to folks about gratitude? Because
Yeah.
I'm just gonna
You
I'm
said
just
a
gonna
few
leave it at
minutes.
that and
Oh
open it
man.
up. Yeah, I
Yeah,
know.
let's
Well, it's
go.
already been going. It's crazy, but like,
It's
tell me about gratitude.
oh geez. It's the thing, man. It's the thing. It's a skill, it's a muscle, it's a feeling and an emotion. Um, so I became interested in gratitude because I was really interested in studying religion and philosophy as an undergraduate. Um, I was reading all these things and particularly diving into a lot of like Eastern uh, writings and doing my own meditation. And this is in the early 2000s before it was cool. And it was cool for some, but it wasn't cool for a college kid to like tell your friends like, you guys go out, I'm gonna meditate and journal. I should have done a little more of that, by the way. I overcorrected a little much. There's a golden mean to all this, of course.
Sure.
Anyway, so but enough of that. So gratitude was like this thing, this signal that just kept hitting. It was like gratitude, gratitude. And I just started reading more about it and really starting to go deeper and deeper. Like, so okay, you've got all the philosophies, you have Cicero saying gratitude is not just among the virtues, but the mother of them all. And you have Adam Smith, who said gratitude is like basically the foundation of a healthy society and civilization. And then onward, right? You have, all these different platitudes around gratitude. And when I was looking into it, there was like nothing on how it worked in the body, like what actually happens when we feel grateful. And so that's where I decided to set up camp. So I really wanted to investigate that niche. Nobody studied gratitude at the time. Luckily, Antonio was like, "This is cool. Let's do this. This seems really interesting." Whereas every other potential lab, they're like, "Nobody studies that. Don't waste your time." And so I dived in, and so what I've really found is that gratitude is it's absolutely a skill. It's a skill. It's a disposition, and it's really a thing that like it really does help with resilience. It really does help with performance. Like the more we can be grateful for a challenge, the more we can be grateful for something that we have to learn that we really didn't wish we really didn't want to learn, right? The more we can be grateful for experiences we really wish we didn't have to go through. I was working on my dissertation on gratitude while my mom was dying.
Mm.
And I had this kind of really weird experience because I was studying this emotion and this practice and this framework that has so many manifestations in our health and on our philosophies. And yet I was going through my worst nightmare. And what I really learned about gratitude was that it's not what people say it is. Typically, it's not a synonym for happiness. It can be related, of course. It's not a synonym for getting things that are nice. It's not a synonym for getting a cool present or something like that. Though we can certainly have gratitude for presents, and we certainly should, right? But what I really learned is gratitude is a not too distant cousin to pain in its own way. That gratitude is often a feeling that happens when our own deepest dignity is respected and seen. That when somebody really sees us and says, "Hey, I think I can help with something that you're facing," those are often the deepest experiences of gratitude that we
Mm.
can have. And they're motivating and they're powerful. They're not the same as just being happy. It's not the same as um, eating ice cream or something. Though we certainly can have gratitude for ice cream, of course.
Sure. Sure.
But that's what I've learned about gratitude is that when you're really fostering and practicing and working on this feeling, it's a very complicated, very slippery feeling. But the more you start to see it as a vehicle for calm, for contented, and for motivation to be
Mm.
close to others, and also for the various ways in which our own dignity can be recognized and the way we can share humanity with others through gratitude and through recognizing others. This is where you get those really powerful upward cycles.
Yeah.
And so that's that's my perspective on it. It's interesting, it's sad my mom didn't make it long enough for me to see me complete my dissertation. So of course it was really tough to defend and just be like, well, there's one person here who would have really liked this,
Yeah, man.
and but I carry that legacy because I've carried this incredible lesson of
Sure.
course being so grateful that I had such a good mom. Um, but also that, like, what gratitude really does, it's not what people say it is. Look, if you want to put it on a tapestry next to your live laugh love posters, then awesome, like, of course, let her rip, right? But it's what we're gonna have, I think, because gratitude is having such a moment.
Sure.
I really want to step in front of the cynicism that's going to come.
Sure.
As anything that grows in our public awareness, the backlash follows.
Mhm.
And what I want to say is, let's be really, really kind. Let's be really precise about what gratitude is and what it isn't, and really work on fostering just that sense of appreciation for our own dignity, our own life, our own challenges and stressors and things like that. Because that to me is where gratitude starts to really work its magic, when you're like, this sucks. There's nothing I want to do about this, but I can find a way to be grateful for it. Not saying it's not hard, not saying
Mhm.
not entering into a state of denial, but well, I'm going to learn something that's going to really connect me to others. Um, that's, to me, that's been my skill, my challenge. Of course, I'm still a student of it. Definitely have
Sure.
a long way to go on it, but I think
Sure.
that's the model that I'm striving for, at least.
So, I mean, Glenn, first off, thank you for sharing that and for, for digging into all of that. I, d- the framework we put forward at the beginning, although obviously limited, was talking about emotions and feelings and introspection. Is gratitude an emotion? Is it a feeling? Is it a top down skill set we're doing? Is it a loop? Is it more complicated than that?
Yes and no.
Sure.
It would be what we call an emotional feeling.
Okay.
In the taxonomy of emotion, it's a social emotion and a moral emotion. It's a motivator to bind ourselves to others.
Mhm.
It's also, a feeling that's related to relief. So in my research, when we actually discovered is the wrong word, sorry. When we were the first people to publish a direct study of the neural correlates of gratitude.
Hmm.
Um, that's not saying it's a discovery, right? It's just something that we did.
Sure.
But we saw that the brain regions active were for those associated with interpersonal bonding and joy, right? So it's a cycle, it's a behavior, it's a lot of things, right? It's a moral motive, in kind of the affective neuroscience, meaning the neuroscience of feelings. It would be slated as a social and moral
Hmm.
emotion, um, and thought of as a very, people would put it at like a really high level thing, but to me, it's really deep into our homeostasis. In
Hmm.
fact, we published a study. Actually, it wasn't a study. We published a review article, and I'm so proud of it, but I think like nobody's actually read it. It's with a student I was working with, named Max Henning, and we posited an evolutionary role for gratitude, linking
Hmm.
back to opioids, right, or endogenous opioids, showing that um, there are receptors in our skin that code for human touch,
Hmm.
right, and they're really tied to these social systems because um, as we kind of reason that in the grasslands, if you're covered in ticks, you have this allostatic burden all the time, right? So if you look back to our ancestors, um, moving into the grasslands where you have all these burdens and all these what we call
Sure.
allostatic burdens that you can't reach, what do? You need somebody else to get them,
Sure.
right? And that's part of why there's a whole host of research on this and theorizing about why it feels so good to be touched,
Hmm.
and why being touched makes us want to touch other people, has to do with the lessening of the allostatic burden of having these parasites on us,
Hmm.
right? And what this creates, like, is systems for social currency, right? For hierarchy, for working with others. Um, and I think it's a beautiful theory showing that emotion, like gratitude, that we think of are these high level, like, oh, what a slippery, crazy, hard, abstract concept, can boil down to like the fundamental exchange of value between people.
So interesting.
Essentially, put it in print, but I
Yeah,
think it's a really good case. I just have to be, a scientist still and say like
of
maybe,
course. No, of course. No,
but I think it's a
that's
good maybe. I think it's a very strong. I that book that article is open access and
nice.
people should dive in. It's a fun article.
Super cool. Okay. So, wow, so much. Um, I wanna stitch this together a little bit. Um, so one of the reasons that I was excited to have this talk today is that in most of the roles of the folks who are listening to this, the roles that they're inhabiting are things that are ultra high stress, often life or death, often bumping up against, horror and suffering and just a whole host of things that are hard, to put it mildly. Right.
Mhm.
Sometimes they are hard and necessary, and we're honored and grateful to be the ones doing them. And sometimes they're just plain damn hard. But I think that we've talked a lot on this podcast about, um, the way the brain works when we're making certain types of decisions. And I wanted to get us into gratitude because I think that in my own life, it's been part of my answer to what gets you through a lot of this stuff, right? Is you can't change a lot of things, but you can hold on to that and build up that foundation of gratitude around stuff. And you'll forgive me again for hand waving around gratitude a little bit as I'm doing this, but I think that there's a lot of depth in there. Um, Unexpectedly, in terms of what I had set out, we got really deep into this idea of like, what is the role of emotion in decision making, which I know we just barely scratched the surface of, which is so cool. We wandered into tacit knowledge transfer. We wandered a little bit into, sort of some of the ways that we compute decision making, and there's a whole layer to this that we didn't really apply, which was how does all of these systems work when you're in extremis, right? How do they work when you're in life or death scenarios, or when you feel like you're in a life or death scenario, or when there is, everything's on fire all around you. But I think we laid an incredible foundation for that. So I'm gonna ask right away, like even on the recording thing, can we do a round two of this in the very near future where we talk about that piece of it? We sort of like start here and then build from there.
Yeah.
Um, but I'll also ask as we close this out if you want to issue a challenge to anybody listening to this, something that you want them to try differently or do differently after hearing this episode. And if they're like me, they're walking away from this with their minds blown anyway, and there's probably no shortage of things they can try next. But what is it that you want them to do?
I mean, it's really simple. I'm so sorry I don't have something more profound, but like,
Glad we really got down into consciousness and the meaning of existence and how
yeah.
humans work. I think we hit profound. I
Okay, all
think
right.
we're
Well, I mean,
okay.
look, just listen to what makes your heart sing, listen to it. I mean, reach out. I'm easy to get a hold of.
Yeah.
And like practice gratitude. Here's what I want you to do. If you're in a leadership position, so I'm standing up this company right now. It's called Grateful OS.
Mm-hmm.
And it's everything I know about high performance and gratitude. And I'm packaging it and taking it on the road. And right now, what it looks like is me just kind of giving talks to groups. And what I hope it evolves into is a suite of tools, programs, experiences, where people can really put this science into heart. Um, I think it's actually going to be much simpler than I think it is, because when I talk to leaders who say, you know what, all I do, I had a great chat with a VC portfolio last week. And one of the founders was like, this is so good. This is exactly what I do. Thank you for providing the science behind it. But
Mm-hmm.
we just, every other week, we have a gratitude sit down, and we have a team of engineers and really tough people, and they say it's the time of the week they look forward to the most. It's a 30-minute meeting. Go around, say what you're grateful for, and let's finish our week on that. So I'm saying out there for those of you who are leaders of groups, um, put try it out. Put some sort of gratitude ritual
Nice.
to your meetings, into your teams. Get up and walk around if you're in a physical workplace or if you've got a Slack channel, and just drop some notes of thanks. Don't wait for people to be grateful for you. That's not how it works. Go say thank you and go try to build systems for gratitude into your company, and let me know how it goes. And if you need a hand, reach out, of course. But that's what I want people to do. If you happen to be in the position where you get to lead or take care of or manage people, try to bake some gratitude into something boring and tell me how it goes. Just call it an experiment. It can go any different way. I'm not giving a total prescription. This is going to unlock your peak potential and all that.
Sure.
You do gratitude on one meeting and you're at your IPO next month.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's an experiment, and you're going to be different than I am, and Dan's going to be different than you. Bake it into your routine somehow, and just treat it like an experiment, and then see what the results are.
I love it. Glenn, thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you, Dan. Always a pleasure, man.
So if you want to find out more about Glenn or reach out to him, you can visit his website. It's glennrfox.com. That's GLENNRFOX.com. All right, folks, that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you learned something and I hope you enjoyed. As always on this podcast, our goal is to dive deep into what it takes to perform under pressure. Nothing that we discuss here should be construed as medical advice, and all of the opinions that we discuss are our own and are not necessarily representative of any organization with which we were affiliated or for whom we work. If you want to go even deeper and get more involved, don't forget to check out our book. It's called The Emergency Mind: Wiring Your Brain for Performance Under Pressure, and you can find it at emergencymind.com/book. All right, good luck out there.